The concrete floor of the cellar was always cold, even in July, but by late November it felt like standing on a slab of river ice. Valera kept her boots on, the thick-soled ones with the brass eyelets that her father had greased with lard to keep out the Oregon damp, but the chill still found its way through the wool socks, settling into the marrow of her ankles. Above her, the floorboards of the kitchen creaked with a rhythmic, heavy tread. Garrick was pacing again. He always paced when the weather turned, his boots clicking against the yellow linoleum like fingernails on a dry gourd. Down here, the air smelled of wet coal, rusted iron, and the sour, cabbage-like tang of graywater that had backed up in the floor drain during the high tide 2 days ago. Valera bent over the galvanized wash tub, her forearms red and slick with grease-cutting soap. She wrung out one of Garrick's heavy work shirts, her knuckles turning the color of lard under the strain. The water in the tub was lukewarm, skimmed with a gray film of skin flakes, coal dust, and the yellow ointment Garrick smeared over his chest every morning to quiet his congested tubes. He was a man who seemed to be held together by nothing but vinegar and thin paper. His skin was the color of a turnip that had spent the winter at the bottom of a root cellar, and he treated his own body like a delicate, sacred relic that Valera was personally trying to desecrate. He could not eat bread that had been baked with commercial yeast. He could not sleep on sheets that had been dried near the pine grove because the pollen made his eyelids swell like plums. He could not lift a shovel of coal without his wrists clicking and his lower back locking up, in a way that required him to lie on the settee for 3 days while Valera brought him beef broth and hot bricks wrapped in flannel. Yet he had enough strength to scream. The cellar door at the top of the stairs rattled on its hinges, then swung inward with a dry screech. The light from the kitchen, a harsh, unshaded 60-watt bulb, spilled down the wooden steps, cutting through the damp gloom of the basement. Garrick stood at the top, his silhouette narrow and stooped, like an old crow perched on a fence post. He was holding a blue-rimmed enamel mug, the steam rising from it in a thin, erratic curl. Valera, his voice had that nasal, high-pitched edge that always made the skin behind her ears tighten. It was a voice that didn't travel from the chest. It came from the sinuses, dry and scraping, like two shingles rubbing together in a high wind. She didn't look up from the tub. She kept her fingers worked into the collar of his flannel shirt, scrubbing the gray ring of neck grease against the ridges of the washboard. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Valera, I'm talking to you. He took 2 steps down the stairs. The wood groaned under his heel. The tea has no skin on it. You didn't boil the milk. I told you, if the milk isn't boiled until the skin forms, the fat doesn't break down. It sits in my stomach like cold lard. Do you want me to have the colic again? Is that what you're after? After the night I had with my head? The milk was hot, Garrick, she said, her voice flat, pitched just loud enough to clear the rumble of the belt-driven Maytag washer in the corner. I saw the steam myself. Steam isn't boiling. He descended another 3 steps, his face coming into the gray light of the cellar. His nose was red-rimmed and peeling at the nostrils, raw from the linen handkerchiefs he kept stuffed in his sleeve. His small, pale eyes waterlogged behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. You do it on purpose. You've got a lazy streak in you, Valera, just like your father. He'd let a horse rot in the harness before he'd grease the leather, and you're the same. My mother never gave my father a cup of tea that wasn't fit for a human being. She knew how to keep a house. Valera kept scrubbing. The soap was starting to bite into the small cuts on her thumbs. She thought of Eldred, her mother-in-law, a woman with wrists like iron bars and a mouth that looked like a drawstring purse pulled tight. Eldred had lived 40 years with a man who died of a swollen liver, and she had spent every one of those years looking at Valera as if she were a weed that had sprouted in her cabbage patch. Your mother had 3 daughters to help her, Valera said softly, her eyes fixed on the dirty water. My mother had hands that knew how to work, Garrick shouted. He was on the bottom step now, the cold of the concrete floor drawing a visible shiver from his narrow shoulders. He set the enamel mug down on the wooden stringer of the stairs with a sharp clatter. She didn't spend her days staring out the window at the gulls. And she didn't have a cousin like Carrie's who could sew a double-seamed shirt before breakfast while you can't even get the starch right in my collars. The name Carrie's went through the cellar like a draft of cold river air. Valera's fingers stopped moving on the washboard. The soapy water dripped from her knuckles, hitting the surface of the tub with a series of small, heavy plops. Carrie's. Carrie's was her aunt's youngest, born with skin like fresh cream and hair that smelled of sweet clover even in the dead of winter. At the family gathering in Tillamook 2 summers ago, Carrie's had sat on the porch in a pale blue gingham dress, her fingers moving like small white birds as she knitted a baby's bonnet, while Valera had been in the back kitchen, gutting 20 pounds of Chinook salmon until her apron was black with blood and fish scales. Garrick had sat on the porch rail for 3 hours that afternoon, his eyes following Carrie's ankles every time she shifted her weight. Carrie's, Garrick sneered, leaning his shoulder against the damp cellar wall, his face twisting into that thin, self-satisfied grimace he used when he knew he had found a soft spot. Now there's a woman who knows what a man needs. She doesn't have that sour look about her. Her mother taught her how to speak to a husband. I should have taken her when I had the chance. Her father offered to set us up in the dry goods shop in Portland. I'd be sitting in an office right now, out of this salt rot, with a wife who didn't smell like laundry soap and coal oil. He spat into the corner near the coal bin, then turned and began to climb the stairs, his boots heavy and deliberate. Get those shirts dried by tonight, he called back over his shoulder, his voice retreating into the warmth of the kitchen. The wind is coming out of the north. If they hang on the line, they'll smell of the fish cannery and my chest won't stand it. Use the machine. The door slammed shut above. The latch clicked into place with a dry, metallic snap. Valera stood perfectly still in the gray light. The belt of the Maytag washer squealed as it turned, a rhythmic, mechanical groan that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her boots and into her teeth. She looked at her hands. They were white and wrinkled from the water, the skin around her nails ragged and red. She looked at the corner of the cellar where the small green-painted pine cabinet hung on the stone wall. It was a cheap cabinet, built by her father from scrap lumber, the door held shut by a twisted loop of copper wire. Inside it sat 5 square boxes, their cardboard tops sealed with yellowing wax. They were dryer sheets, a new brand, Meadowbreeze, that Garrick had ordered through the mail catalog after reading an advertisement in the Oregonian. The ad had promised the softness of a mother's touch and the scent of mountain clover in every thread. Garrick had been convinced. He was always convinced by things that came in boxes with pictures of mountains on them. He had insisted that his shirts were too stiff, that the salt air made the cotton like sheet iron, and that he deserved the very softest clothes because his skin was thin-blooded. Valera had tried them once on a load of his undergarments. 2 hours after he put the union suit on, his skin had turned the color of a boiled lobster. He had broken out in great, weeping wheals from his collarbone to his ankles, his eyes swelling until he looked like a blind pig. He had stayed in bed for 4 days, cursing the damp, cursing the water, cursing the mold in the cellar walls that he was sure had infected his clothes. Valera had gone to Eldred's house that week to ask her what she used to make his clothes soft when he was a boy. The old woman had been sitting by her stove, scraping the skin off a salt pork side. She hadn't looked up when she spoke. He can't have none of that scented fat, Eldred had said, her voice like gravel sliding down a chute. His skin is like his father's. Anything with a perfume or a chemical to it will skin him alive. I used nothing but wood ash water and elbow grease. If he's asking for those fancy sheets, you tell him no. He's too stupid to know what's good for him, but you ain't. Valera had told him. She had laid the boxes out on the kitchen table and told him exactly what his mother had said. Garrick had laughed, that dry, rattling snort of his. My mother is 70 years old and doesn't know a thing about modern science, he had said, shoving the boxes back into her apron. She used lard soap because she was cheap. These are made with refined tallows, the paper says so. They're clean, you just don't want to spend the extra nickel on them. You put them in the dryer, Valera. I want my shirts soft. She had hidden them in the cellar cabinet instead, using nothing but vinegar in the rinse water to keep his skin from flaying off, letting him believe the softness came from his modern science. Now, Valera walked over to the green cabinet. Her boots made no sound on the damp concrete. She reached up, her fingers cold and steady, and unlooped the copper wire. The cabinet smelled of them. Even through the cardboard and the wax, the scent of Meadowbreeze was thick and oily, a synthetic lavender that smelled like kerosene mixed with rotting lilies. It was a smell that had nothing to do with meadows or breeze. It was the smell of a factory that had tried to bottle a memory and ended up with a poison. She pulled out a box. The cardboard was damp, the blue ink of the label slightly smudged by the cellar air. She tore the perforated top. Inside, the sheets lay in a neat, gray-white stack, looking like pieces of dried skin that had been pressed flat under a heavy book. When she touched them, her fingertips felt immediately coated in a thin, greasy film of tallow and chemical perfume. She looked at the dryer, a heavy, drum-like cylinder that ran on coal gas, its iron flue venting through the cellar window. She took the load of wet flannel shirts from the washboard tub. They were heavy, holding the cold water like wool blankets. She shoved them into the iron mouth of the dryer. Then she reached into the box. She didn't take 1 sheet, she took 5. She pulled them out in a clump, her fingers digging into the waxy fibers, and threw them deep into the center of the wet clothes, burying them in the folds of the flannel. She went to the next box, the Springtime Clover brand, and pulled out another handful. These were thinner, smelling of artificial pine and laundry starch. She stuffed them into the pockets of his work trousers. She put 3 into the sleeves of his wool blend sweaters. She took a handful of the April freshness sheets and rubbed them vigorously against the inside of his cotton undershirts until the white fabric was gray with the waxy residue of the chemical softener. She worked slowly, methodically, her breath coming in even white plumes in the cold cellar air. There was no rush. The kitchen above was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Garrick moved from the stove to the table. When she was finished, there were 24 dryer sheets distributed through the small load of laundry. The air in the cellar had changed. The smell of wet coal and gray water was gone, completely smothered by a thick, sweet grease that made the back of Valera's throat itch. It was a suffocating, chemical fog that seemed to coat the stone walls and grease the window panes. She closed the heavy iron door of the dryer and turned the brass gas valve. She struck a match against the stone wall. The blue flame leaped from the iron burner with a soft whoosh, and the drum began to turn with a low, heavy rumble. Thump clack, thump clack. Valera stood by the machine for a moment, watching the small blue flame through the peephole. She could hear the sheets inside, sliding against the hot iron, releasing their oils into the steam, driving the artificial scent deep into the pores of the heavy cotton and the wool. She went up the stairs, carrying the empty wash tub. Garrick was sitting at the kitchen table, his wire-rimmed spectacles slid down his nose, reading a 3-day-old newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered, but he sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "What's that smell?" he asked, his voice thick. "Did you spill the coal oil?" "No," Valera said, setting the tub by the sink. "It's the laundry. I used the sheets, the ones you wanted." He grunted, his eyes still on the paper. "About time you started listening to me. A man shouldn't have to beg for a soft collar in his own house." By 8 o'clock that night, the house was warm, the wood stove in the parlor throwing a red glow through its iron grates. But the air was heavy. The scent of the dryer sheets had risen through the floorboards, filling the kitchen, the hallway, and the small bedroom under the eaves. It was so thick that the tallow seemed to settle on the oil lamps, creating a greasy halo around the yellow flames. Garrick sat in his armchair by the stove, his wool trousers on, his feet resting on a low stool. He was already rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "It's dusty in here," he muttered, his voice sounding more nasal than usual. "You didn't sweep under the sideboard, Valera. My throat is raw." "I swept," she said from the kitchen where she was drying the tin plates. "The wind must be bringing the salt dust off the flats." "No," he snorted, his chest giving a small, dry rattle. "It's different, it's a dry heat." He reached down and scratched his shin through his trousers. He did it once, then again, his nails making a sharp, scraping sound against the wool. By 9, they went to bed. The bedroom was small, the ceiling sloping down so low on one side that Garrick had to duck his head when he got into the bed. The sheets on the bed were old cotton, washed weeks ago, but Garrick's pajamas, the thick, blue-striped flannel ones, had come straight from the cellar dryer. Valera lay on her side of the bed, her back to him, her eyes wide open in the darkness. The room was cold, but Garrick was hot. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a dry, feverish warmth that smelled of chemical lavender and hot mutton fat. Within 10 minutes, the snorting began. It started as a wet click in the back of his throat, like a pebble rolling around in a pipe. He cleared his throat once, twice, the sound dry and hacking in the small room. "Valera," he whispered, his voice thick and wet. "My head is full. Did you leave the larder door open? The damp is coming up." "The door is shut, Garrick," she said into the dark. He turned over, the mattress ticking, groaning under his weight. He drew his breath in through his nose, a long, whistling gasp that ended in a sharp, wet snap as his nasal passages closed. He let the breath out through his mouth with a heavy huff. Then he began to scratch. It was a soft sound at first, the friction of his skin against the flannel pajamas. Scritch, scritch. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew faster, more urgent. She could hear the fabric of his trousers being pulled tight as he dug his nails into his thighs. "My legs are on fire," he muttered. He sat up in the darkness, the bed springs screaming. He pulled his pajama top over his head, throwing it onto the floor. "The air is dirty tonight. It's that wood ash you used on the hearth. I told you you don't clean it out right." In the dim light from the window, Valera could see his pale back. Even in the gray shadow, she could see the dark, raised patches where his skin was already beginning to react to the waxy tallow that had been ground into the flannel fibers by the heat of the dryer. He looked like a man who had been dragged through a patch of stinging nettles. He lay back down, his chest heaving as he tried to breathe through his mouth. His tongue felt dry, his throat swollen. Every time he took a breath, the synthetic scent of the meadow breeze that had saturated the pillowcase, which she had also rubbed with the sheets, found its way into his lungs, making his bronchial tubes tighten like old leather straps. Snort, wheeze, scritch, he turned again, his knees coming up to his chest. He was gasping now, his breath coming in short, panicked jerks. I can't get the air, Valera, get the menthol rub, it's on the dresser. Valera didn't move. She lay with her cheek pressed against her own pillow, the one she had kept in the kitchen drawer away from the cellar steam. Valera! His voice was a wet croak now, his throat so swollen he could barely form the consonants. The menthol rub is empty, Garrick, she said, her voice steady and soft in the dark. You used the last of it on Tuesday. I told you we needed more from the store, but you said we couldn't afford the quarter. He let out a low, miserable groan, his hand going to his throat. He began to scratch his neck, his fingernails tearing at the skin under his jaw until she heard the faint, wet sound of a welt breaking. The room, it smells like soap, he gasped, his head rolling on the pillow. Did you put something in the wash? Just what you asked for, she said. She turned her head slightly, looking at him through the gloom. His eyes were small, red slits in his swollen face, his spectacles lying forgotten on the nightstand. He looked small, he looked like a wet, hairless dog that had been thrown out into the rain. All his authority, all his talk of Carrie's and his mother and his father's dry goods shop had been reduced to this. A wet rattle in his throat and the sound of his own nails tearing at his skin. She turned her face back to the window. Through the glass, she could see the dark outline of the hemlock trees bending in the north wind. The rain was coming down now, a steady, heavy patter that washed the salt dust off the roof. It was a clean sound. A cold, clean sound that had nothing to do with factories or boxes or the sweet, oily smell of a meadow that never existed. Beside her, Garrick snorted, a long, bubbling gasp that seemed to shake his entire frame, followed by the dry, frantic scraping of his fingers against his ribs. Valera closed her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the tension in her shoulders slip away. The sound of his misery was like the ticking of a grandfather clock, steady, predictable, and remarkably soothing. She drifted off to sleep to the rhythmic, wet rasp of his breathing, the soft scritch-scritch of his fingernails, and the clean, cold smell of the rain outside. The boxes lasted through the winter. Valera was careful with them. She didn't use them all at once again. She didn't want him to die, after all. A dead husband brought inquiries, and Eldred would come with her iron wrists to nose through the cellar. No, she used them with the precision of an apothecary administering a slow, restorative poison. Every third load of his underwear got 2 sheets. His work shirts got 1, hidden in the sleeves. His socks, the thick wool ones he wore to keep his weak ankles, warm, were stored in a drawer where 3 of the Cloverbreeze sheets lay flat beneath the paper liner, slowly sweating their chemical oils into the wool. All through December and January, Garrick lived in a state of dry, red-rimmed misery. His nose was a permanent scab, his eyes watery and yellow at the corners. He went to the doctor in Astoria twice, paying $3 a visit, money he had saved for a new leather bridle. But the doctor could find nothing but a dryness of the blood and prescribed a sulfur ointment that smelled like rotten eggs and made his skin itch even worse when combined with the waxy residue of the sheets. He grew quiet. He didn't have the breath to scream about the milk or the starch in his collars. He spent his evenings sitting by the stove, his hands wrapped in greasy flannel rags to keep him from scratching his skin raw, his head back as he tried to draw a clean breath through his nose. Sometimes he would look at Valera with a strange, watery appeal in his eyes, as if he wanted her to explain why his own body had turned against him. She would only smile, that small, patient nod she had practiced for years, and offer him another cup of tea made with the milk that had been boiled until the skin formed, just the way he liked it. They were divorced 3 years later. It wasn't because of the laundry, not directly. A man who cannot breathe and whose skin is perpetually peeling is not a man who can keep up a farm or a name. He grew bitter, more petulant, until one spring morning he packed his cardboard trunk and went back to his mother's house, claiming that the coastal air was killing him and that Valera's family had cursed him with a damp house. Valera had stayed in the house. She had painted the kitchen a pale, clean yellow and thrown the old linoleum out into the yard. Now, 40 years later, she stood in the aisle of the modern supermarket in Coos Bay. The air conditioning was cold, hummed with a low, clean vibration that was nothing like the old cellar Maydag. The shelves were bright, stacked with plastic bottles of orange and blue and purple. She stopped in front of the laundry section. There they were, row upon row of them. Blue boxes with pictures of cartoon bears and white clouds promising sun-kissed meadows and April rain. She reached out, her hand now spotted with the brown marks of age, her knuckles permanently thickened by the cold water of her youth. She picked up a box of the scented sheets. Even through the modern plastic wrap and the thick cardboard, the scent came through, that same waxy, synthetic lavender smelling of hot grease and petroleum. A young woman, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her arms full of plastic bottles, stopped beside her. "Do those work?" the girl asked, looking at the box in Valera's hand. "My husband says our towels smell like damp dog, but I'm worried they'll make him break out. He's got sensitive skin." Valera looked at the girl. She looked at her chapped lips, the tired shadow under her eyes, and the small, red spot on her wrist where she had burned herself on a stove. Valera smiled. It was a small, dry smile that didn't reach her eyes, but it was very sweet. "Oh, they work," Valera said, her voice soft and steady. "They make everything very soft. Especially if you use a handful." She set the box back on the shelf, her fingers lingering for a second on the smooth cardboard, then turned her cart and walked toward the light of the automatic doors, the sweet, chemical scent of her youth following her like an old, familiar friend.